Great. I think we can go ahead and start. Thank you all so much for joining this breakout group. By way of introduction, my name is Sarah Poole. I'm the Deputy Director for UNDP's Regional Bureau for Arab States. And on behalf of all of us, we're delighted that you're joining us for this breakout group for what I think also just connecting to the opening panel is really both an extremely relevant example and I think an important discussion, building on what we've heard already from the different speakers on the impact of COVID-19 on fragile contexts 1 year after the declaration of the COVID-19 pandemic, and really the lessons learned from the impact on the fragile context. I think much of what we heard already in the opening resonates certainly to me, and I think also coming out of this discussion, focusing on Iraq, whether it's issues that came up time and time again, something that we've been emphasizing, the impact of COVID-19, the socioeconomic impact on the most vulnerable, on the concept of leaving no one behind, and really that notion of what is the impact, what are the implications also on the poorest and the most marginalized, also with a very strong focus on women at the front line, also women, vulnerable women especially being the most impacted. The second point that really resonated to me was also this very strong notion of the local and the national ownership of the response, but also that concept and that reality and action of building back better and the recovery, but also very much the collaboration. I think we heard from all of the speakers that given the challenges, given the enormity, that this is really a time for collaboration. Building the local to the regional, to the national, to the regional, to the global, and bringing together all stakeholders. And then the third element that really resonated was the need for the need assessment to inform the priority actions for the building back better, so that we don't lose on the development gains on the one hand, but that the recovery really takes into account the priority needs, whether it's on the green recovery, issues around social protection, issues around governance, and taking that lens forward, but really on an informed basis. So as we reflect on the opening session and move on to the discussion around Iraq, the aim of this specific session is to present you with the thoughts of UNDP in Iraq on how to ensure a sustainable post-COVID-19 recovery for the country. And I'm very pleased that this was actually captured in a policy brief, which we would like to present and also exchange with you in the brief time that we have together. So we'll start the session first with a message from the Iraqi Minister of Planning, Professor Dr. Khalid Batal al-Najam, on addressing the importance of addressing the key fragility drivers in the post-COVID-19 recovery. And then after that, we'll have a brief presentation on the key points of a fragility-based post-COVID-19 recovery by our resident representative in Iraq, Ms. Zaina Ali Ahmad. And then we'll have time for a question and answer session where we hope to hear from you on the different topics that emerge from the policy brief and from the opening remarks from our speakers. Similar to the opening panel, we have the chat box, which is open. So I would encourage you to put your comments in there so that we can make sure that we can address as many as possible in the time that we have. And I would also like to announce that the session is being recorded and it will be made available on the session site after the session is completed. And now, without further ado, it's my honor, I would like to introduce His Excellency, the Iraqi Minister of Planning, Professor Dr. Khalid Batal al-Najam, for the first remarks for this breakout session. Barbara, over to you.
Over the last year, Iraq has faced so many difficulties. We have seen livelihood and employment severely affected by the pandemic and the economic crisis, where the number of youth or young people who are looking for jobs is increasing. Also, a significant increase in the number of individuals needing social protection support, whether they are from IDPs or even the people who are living at their home. All these multidimensional factors have forced Iraqi fragility. That's why we are developing our own recovery strategy with UNDP's support, using this very lens, taking a multidimensional approach to sustainable recovery. with fragility at the center. The Iraq people have never stopped aspiring to a better future, no matter what challenges are thrown their way. Time and time again, we have shown our ability to recover in the face of adversity. The government is wholly committed to doing all it can to ensure the efficient and sustainable recovery from the pandemic for all Iraqis, and in particular for the most vulnerable ones. Thank you.
Thank you so much to His Excellency the Minister, which has really provided the backdrop for the discussion and the session. Let me now pass the floor to Zaina, our resident representative, who's going to be taking us through the key elements of the fragility-based COVID-19 recovery in Iraq. Zaina, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm trying just to share the presentation. Screen sharing failed to start. Can someone please, Barbara, can you put on the slides?
Yes, I will play the slides. And Zina, also, if you can turn on your camera, we still cannot see.
I tried, it's still black.
Copy. Okay, I will show the slides.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Sarah, for moderating this discussion for UNDP Iraq, and thank you, colleagues, for attending this, this brainstorming, this breakout session. Let me start by saying, why did we develop this policy brief? If I may, to put a context. We started thinking on COVID-19 and how the recovery would look like. We wanted to be a little bit proactive in sensing how would it look like in a country like Iraq. We wanted to trigger a discussion on what it means to recover from shocks like COVID, like the oil crisis, like a political turmoil in an extreme fragile context like this country. And we've heard also from the Minister how disabling this pandemic was on Iraq. We also wanted to think around a set of policy recommendations. How do we do some sort of an enabling environment for the return to a sustainable development trajectory for all of the segments of the country? How do we help the government to look at that? We all know that fragility occurs over a spectrum of intensity, but all countries and societies exhibit fragility at one point or another, and to some extent. If anything, this crisis has shown this. However, it plays differently in countries which are fragile, like Iraq. In Iraq, we see the various drivers of fragility continuously feed on each other in an interconnected manner. We see it creating a vicious circle. As such, we started to think on what would it look like if we are going to not only recover, but recover better than it used to be in these years before. And our premise is for that to happen, a successful development intervention should be launched, but should aim at decreasing vulnerabilities at the center of what we're doing. This requires a very clear understanding of all the drivers of fragility, how multidimensional they are, how interconnected they are, how do they react to shocks and stresses. And then this took us, of course, to a discussion around this can only be done maybe through a strong state society trust for the country to leap on. Next, please. Next slide. These are some of the priorities that our policy note has put forward. We are advocating that if we are to embark on a sustainable recovery trajectory in Iraq, we need to ensure that a number of key steps are put in place, if only to make this happen. Part of our priorities looked at UNDP becoming a fragility integrator. Other priorities should look at the strong social contract, a policy coherence across the HDP spectrum, that we've been trying to do, but I'm not sure that we're reaching there. Forging strategic partnership with HDP actors in the country, joint planning and programming. Let me, Sarah, here drill a little bit on one example of how we're trying to implement that. We've launched a durable solution with other actors, players, NGOs, donors, co-chaired by UNDP and IOM. We've put together an overall strategy and operational action plan, a very solid coordination structure to target those who are most left behind and those who have been coming back to their places of origin at a slower pace. This durable solution strategy and action plan has combined a policy coherence across the humanitarian development and peace spectrum. It has also helped us to forge strategic partnerships with key HDP actors in the country, whether be it the humanitarians, the development, the donor community, but also the peace actors in Iraq. All of this is pinned with a joint planning and programming so that we can address the multidimensional aspects of fragility. Next, please. The study that we're launching today has a number of policy recommendations, including issues around the fragility integrator function, those that are somehow internal to UNDP, but those which are also addressed to the UN system, to the donors, and to the government. We would need to embark on a post-COVID recovery, some policy recommendations for all the stakeholders. Only with the implementation of these policy recommendations would we be able to take a path of recovery that takes into account the key drivers of fragility, also taking into account the peace nexus. We have highlighted a few of these in the slide, but we would like to provide a spotlight on the premise of the fragility integrator function, if I may, and the need to have fragility-based multi-dimensional programming. The idea for us to be a fragility integrator is to support and spearhead the development of strategies and multidimensional programming. This type of programming needs to be pinned and based on data and analysis that covers the humanitarian, the development, and the peace building spectrum. This is not enough if we do not underpin the funding mechanisms and the funding strategies from the donor on this multi-dimensional spectrum. Otherwise, we will not be able to implement this spectrum in fragile contexts like Iraq. I'm very happy that we were able to share our thinking with you, Sarah, and with the audience and our participants, and I look forward to exchanging further on this. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Zainab, for presenting what I think is really an important body of work and also reflections. As I'm sure our participants can relate to, there's a lot of focus, there's a lot of discussion, for example, on what a multi-sectoral, a multi-dimensional approach means, especially in the context of fragility. How do we bring the humanitarian development nexus and the humanitarian development peace nexus to life? And I think very importantly, what does it actually mean to be an integrator? And I think it's very interesting, the connection on the fragility integrator. So as we're receiving questions in the chat box, and I would really encourage participants to bring your questions forward. Zaina, let me just start off by hearing from you. How is UNDP Iraq actually taking these recommendations, which I think are extremely relevant and very useful, actually into action? So how is it actually transforming the way we are working together with our partners, whether within the UN and very much also with the national partners and other international actors?
Thank you, Sarah. We've started. I cannot claim that we have it all right at once, but we've started a number of steps to integrate fragility through several initiatives. Let me start by saying we launched a number of joint analyses with other UN agencies. The socioeconomic impact analysis series focuses on a number of fragility dimensions, so that the aim is to have a deeper understanding of the impact of COVID-19 and the key fragility drivers. We've done one on fragility. We've done also some on social cohesion, social protection, the environment, etc. We've also been able to integrate fragility approach and strategies, plans, and programs. The UN Socioeconomic Recovery Plan and the government of Iraq National Recovery Plan, both supported technically by UNDP, are underpinned by a multidimensional analysis that prioritizes key vulnerabilities. We've launched the process for a reimagined social contract that will identify, hopefully, the fundamental issues of Iraqis. We've also, as I said and mentioned, launched a large-scale durable solutions strategy with a number of key partners, and we're underpinning that with a joint program with UN agencies and NGOs to address the multidimensional needs of displaced individuals and those who have been most left behind. And we are also spearheading a UN system-wide approach to address the needs of specific vulnerable groups. One case in point here is families who are victims of ISIL and those who have been perceived to be affiliated to ISIL families. This all will ensure, hopefully, an integrated, joint, and principled approach to these specific groups. We've also looked inward and started to do a fragility-based multidimensional programming within our own program. The stabilization approach is one case at point that builds on the premise that stabilization priorities fall across the humanitarian development and peace spectrum. But we've also now strengthened very much our area-based programming and implementation. All of our work since last year is underpinned by a comprehensive conflict analysis that highlights the drivers of fragility.
Thank you, Zaina, also for bringing the work and the recommendations and the actions back to that starting point of the issue of addressing vulnerabilities and leaving no one behind, which is the theme that resonated also very strongly from the opening. We have some questions in the chat box. Zaina, in the interest of time, I'm going to give the two together. So the first is from Peter Batchelor, who is asking, are you using an area-based approach to build an integrated approach to fragility in different regions of Iraq, and any reflections that you would want to share on that? And then the second question is from Delphine Colbeau. Let me read it just so everyone has it. Pre-COVID, in many conflict-affected contexts, peace building and stabilization interventions were already the underfunded pillar of the humanitarian development peace nexus. COVID has impacted ODA both in terms of overall amounts and the targeting towards immediate COVID-19 response. So how do we ensure that there is continuous support to critical peace building and stabilization interventions in protracted crisis to avoid a programming gap and potential relapse into violence? I'll hand
Thank you, Sarah.
Questions back to you.
Thank you. Let me, in the interest of time, let me take them one by one. On the area-based approach, yes, we've started that. We were using it only in the areas which were previously occupied by Daesh, ISIL. Now we've moved into an area-based programming also to the other underserved areas of the country, for example, in the south, where we're targeting the most vulnerable groups, most poorest regions of the country, to look at an integration of basic service delivery with renewable energy, for example, with livelihoods creation, with diversification of income resources. So yes, surely, slowly but surely, we're moving into an area-based approach to addressing the challenges that are faced in Iraq. The issue in terms of the continuous support to critical peace building and stabilization is very, very important. I'm not worried about the programming gap as much as I'm worried about the funding gaps. If development partners and donors move away from fragile settings like Iraq when they're a little bit more stable, let me say. And this, one of the main effects of that is actually a potential relapse into violence, definitely, Delphine. And that's a major problem. Whenever we see that there is programming or funding that is decreasing in some areas that have been occupied by ISIL, we see some resurgence of ISIL families. This is why we're advocating that only a multidimensional approach based on the main vulnerabilities in the country will lead us into a sustainable pathway to peace. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Zaina. And I would just alert our participants, we'll be going back to the main, the plenary, if we have that in a virtual space, in about 5 minutes. So there is time for 1 or 2 additional questions if you want to pose anything in the chat box. But while we're looking at those, Zaina, perhaps just a follow-on question. I know it's something that you've been looking at in the overall context of Iraq, and we heard again in the opening session, also the importance elements of really building back a sustainable recovery, and some of the elements that have also come into that, for example, the issues around green recovery or the issues of youth, which also came up very strongly in the minister's opening statement. Anything that you want to reflect on, building on, let's say, the humanitarian peace nexus, the issues of the funding, as you were highlighting on different stabilization approaches, again, for that longer term perspective on the sustainable recovery?
Thank you, Sarah. The issues of youth are extremely, extremely important, not only because Iraq is one of the most youthful countries around the world, but because the underserved and underprivileged and marginalized youth have thrown millions of youth into the streets last year, and they continue on and off. However, there's a little bit of there's some crackdown. So we've seen a little retreat in the protest movement. We have been trying to work very much on mainstreaming youth issues in our programming, not only through targeted interventions to youth for their livelihoods and their bringing up their aspirations, if I may say, but also for amplifying their voices so that we can look at the choices that they are making. Also, our programming, we're in the South on an area-based programming cycle. We're trying to mainstream the issues of green livelihoods so that we can ensure some sort of a green recovery going forward. This, however, will entail that there has to be some enabling environment for diversification of economic resources, but also for the mainstreaming of sustainable environmental issues in the country.
Thank you, Zaina. And we have, we'll take 2 last questions that came in. And in the interest of time, perhaps just a brief reflection on both. The questions are in the chat box, but I will just summarize in the interest of time. The first is, what do you think the impact of COVID might be on relationships across the region? And the second, to sum up a longer question, how in practice does UNDP program to foster her horizontal social cohesion?
Thank you. Again, in the interest of time, I will try to be very brief. On the relationship in the region, we can speak 2 hours on that. We were hoping that a pandemic that has hit the world would bring the region closer together, if I may say. We're not saying that. Regional integration on the economic and the social sides and beyond is very important for building forward better. Whether this is going to happen with the geopolitical tensions and the new global order, world order, let me say, I'm not sure. Social cohesion remains a very, very important part of what we do in UNDP Iraq. As I said, conflict sensitivity and social cohesion are mainstream in all of our axes and programming over the last year, but also over the coming 3 years. Because only with social cohesion can we ensure that there is a pathway towards lasting peace and lasting stability in this country. And we're working very much, again, very briefly, on enabling societal groups at the community level and at the governorate level, while also supporting at the national level an enabling environment for peace. At the local level, we work with local peace structures, youth groups, community groups, to work around horizontal social cohesion. We're also working with religious and media groups to foster solutions towards peace. I know we have to move, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Zaina. And perhaps just in your closing reflections, I think this is already just in 30 minutes has given us not just food for thought, but I think very important reflections. But just in your closing thoughts, if you can share with us, how does the UN come together to do this? And how do we also ensure a people-centered approach? I know those are big questions, but maybe just in a one sentence or two, what immediately comes to mind when you think about those questions?
Actually, on the UN, I think our policy recommendations will provide the platform, if agreed with the UN system, so that we can have a comprehensive approach to reducing issues of vulnerability. Durable solutions is one case in point, and that is moving forward. We still have a long way to go, I have to say. But if everyone buys into a comprehensive approach, I think we can move forward on that. And then a people-centered recovery. If one thing, I think we should look at reducing inequalities, because this country, as all countries in the world, have seen many inequalities which are actually being exacerbated by the COVID and the other crises.
Thank you so much, Zaina, and really our thanks and appreciation to you and the team that have been really investing the time, I think, in a fragility approach, which I think is so relevant, not just to this discussion, but I think very importantly to the work that you're doing on the ground. We've reached the end of this breakout group, and I thank everyone for coming. I do encourage you to actually read the policy brief. I think my colleagues, Barbara, might be able to put it in the chat box. And we are also now at the point that we'll return to the closing panel. But just again, my thanks to you, Zaina, and the team, to the minister, and to everyone for not only for coming, but also sharing your questions and thoughts as part of the conversation.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues.
Back at the closing panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah.